thanks. My apologies for not being Chris Birchester. So we're not going to talk about publishing. What's that?
You look better.
No, actually, that's unfortunately not true. Chris is much taller and much more handsome than I am. Anyway, so we're not going to talk about publishing. We're going to talk about selling live games. Has anyone here actually done this? Have either sold, bought, or transferred a live free-to-play game or game as a service of some kind? Nobody. Okay, cool.
Me and Jefferson.
Oh, Jeff has done one. All right, so we have one person out of the entire audience. That's about what I would expect. So the reason that I bothered to do this talk is kind of because Jeff is, as usual, an outlier. The situation that you might be aware of is that you see these headlines around certain transactions being done, and you have no idea what exactly is going on. Are they selling the game? Are they selling the company? Are they selling some portion? And so I thought it probably a good service for the industry to talk a little bit more about this, because it's an exciting part, in my opinion anyway, of where we are right now in terms of live services and games as a service, and the ability to structure outcomes for your company and for your franchises that are pretty unique and modern and are quite different from what we've seen in the past. So a quick agenda. I'm going to go through kind of the things that you might expect. Like who am I? What is an asset sale, which is technically, from a transaction perspective, what it means to sell a live game is an asset sale. We'll get into what that means, why you should care about that, and the pluses and minuses of doing it. Hopefully spending as much time as we can on the nuts and bolts of how do you actually do it. And if you have questions about that, I'd be happy to answer them. Because Chris is a no-show, we have a little bit of extra time, so feel free to fire questions. It's a small audience. We can get into detail if you want to. And so, my company, FunPlus, you may or may not have heard of. We are actually a Silicon Valley startup. So we were founded here in Silicon Valley in 2010. The reason that you may think we're a Chinese company, if you've heard of us, is because we did an asset sale of our own. We sold our casual games division to a Chinese company for $1 billion in 2016. We did not sell the company, we just sold the casual games business. And so this is an example in our own history of the type of transaction that I'm talking about, and why, in self-defense, I'm now giving these talks in order to explain, why we're not a Chinese company. So the company has gone from being a startup, raising 2 rounds of funding for about $85 million total, to now being completely independent. That's a nice artifact of selling our casual game studio, was that all our venture investors exited the company with that transaction. So we are now a 100% independent company with no outside investors and no debt. So we have offices all over Asia in addition to San Francisco. Myself, I actually joined after FunPlus did this deal, but I had done several asset sales, one outbound game sale and one inbound game purchase. So I'm familiar with this kind of transaction type. And so just to get into what I'm talking about, what do we mean when we say, like sell a live game? It is technically, in M&A parlance, an asset sale. And what that means is, you're essentially carving off, you're describing a particular asset of yours that you want to sell to another company, and or in reverse if you want to buy it. And so, in an M&A deal, that blurry set of blobs on the left, there's a lot of things that that a potential buyer of a company or an asset has to kind of keep track of. The one with the red arrow at it refers to transaction character. This is essentially where, if you read up on asset sales, you'll hear about it in kind of traditional parlance, is as a function of an M&A deal. It doesn't have to be like structured that way. I mean, the difference is essentially point number 3 there. In an M&A deal, you're selling the equity of your company, and they are taking the entire liability of all of your history and everything you've ever done, and it is now becoming theirs. In an asset sale, you're just describing that one thing, and then you are selling that off or you are buying it. It sounds simple, it's actually a little bit complicated. But like I said, the opportunity to do this has not always been around. So we, as many of you know, have been in the industry a long time. The opportunity to just sell a franchise like you've seen it, like I think Epic sold, like Gears of War to Microsoft, but these were like fairly rare and very significant franchises and transactions. Now you see it a lot more, and part of the reason is that these games last a lot longer, and they last not necessarily at huge scale, but they last in ways that give them a very nice and comfortable kind of revenue profile. So you can look recently, so I was actually at Green, the first transaction you see in October 2016. So I did that deal where we bought a game called Dragon Soul from a US developer and brought it over to Green, which is a Japanese company. But there are lots. So, like FunPlus, we've already gone through that example. Wuga, a German company, they sold one of their titles. You probably here in San Francisco followed the Peak deal, where Zynga purchased the casual card game business of a company in Turkey called Peak. So these transactions are happening. And so, like, it is, a new type of opportunity. And the types of opportunities are roughly bucketed into three. And they each have different characteristics. Sorry, this thing is better? Yeah. So there's basically, like games that are pre-launch. From the buyer's perspective, they are unproven. So there's limited metrics about them. There's like a lot of scale risk in them. It's hard to understand like what will actually happen when this game is actually put out into the market. Will it succeed? Will it fail? Like, will it be marketable from an LTV, CPI, arbitrage perspective? A lot of questions. There's titles that are actually out in the market and are like kind of growing. So these are proven to some degree. So these are games that are kind of viable, and the developer is pushing them in the marketplace. They're under UA spend. They're actively growing. And then the third category is games that are effectively like either at kind of saturation or past peak, and you can no longer, as the publisher of those games, actively spend against them profitably. They still have an audience in them. They probably like have the characteristics to last like a really long time, but you can't profitably spend money against it and bring new players into the game. The opportunity spaces around each of these types of games look quite different. So from the buyer's perspective, the first one is the scariest, because it's hard to understand in the games business, as we all know, if something's going to be a hit. Early data does not necessarily mean the game is going to be like a monster, and it's hard to agree, depending on where you sit, what that might look like. The success case, the fail case, very much depends on your conviction as the developer, as the potential buyer of this game. It is not the easiest conversation to have. Whereas the second and the third cases are quite a lot simpler and a lot more rewarding for both sides, in that there's a lot of data. And so you don't have to really kind of convince people too much to kind of agree on, here's the data set, here's what it means to run this game. I run my kind of events like this, it produces these types of results. I spend my UA money like this, it produces this kind of a return pattern. I can show you what that means in this country. I can show you what that means with this UA vendor. I can go through it in kind of painstaking detail. And that is a very easy conversation for both sides to kind of digest, because they have a lot of shared context around kind of what the business actually is from a data perspective. The third category of games that are past peak, very similar, even more so, to be honest, because the risk of UA is kind of off the table. From a premium perspective, like what does it mean to sell one of these games? You're most likely to be able to experience a premium scenario in the middle as the developer and the seller. That's because the upper limit case is harder to settle on, whereas the upper limit case for a game that's in kind of past peak or decline, clearly that's already known. The data set shows it. And so you can have a conversation with a potential partner around hey, for strategic reasons, I would love to sell this game now, so I can get all the cash now and use that for alternative development, something else, to do an M&A transaction of your own, whatever your reason might be. You can basically kind of bank that money now and apply it to a strategic initiative going forward. That's the reason to have these types of conversations. So, what's good about them? What's bad about them? So what's good about them is, like I said, you can get the money now. And like that can be a very strategically interesting conversation in that, like in the case of the deal that I referenced with Green and Vagenstoll, it basically stood in place of an equity round. So the developer was looking for equity financing from VCs, couldn't find it, at least not at the terms they wanted. When we approached them with the opportunity to basically sell this title, they had never even heard of that as a possibility. And it took them a while to kind of socialize it with their board and to get to a point where like everyone around the table understood it enough that they could basically sign off on it. And then they got excited because it meant that as a management team, they would not experience any dilution. They would sell this asset out. It was not an equity deal. They would basically be able to get the cash without having to kind of change their corporate structure or change anything about the way they operated except for the lack of this game. So another one of the benefits potentially is that it can actually enable focus. If you have this new area that you want to go into, VR, AR, crypto, whatever it might be, and you have this asset that probably over the long term you're not going to be able to continue to invest in, and strategically it's an overhang for you. Excuse me. Then this can actually enable you to shift your team in a way that enables focus. And that can be a really good strategic reason for doing one of these. The downside, of course, going to the cons list, is that you lose the revenue stream. So if it's a meaningful thing for you over time, you have to just come to terms with that from a revenue management perspective. But there can be some existential questions that come as well. Meaning that if you were the company known for Game X and you just sold it, now you're not the Game X company anymore. You have to come up with basically a new way of positioning yourself or positioning your branding or whatever it might be. So the other stuff, like opportunity cost and time consumption, these deals, like an M&A deal, are a big deal. They can take a long time. You have to share a lot of information. Basically, there's full transparency required across this one game, across this franchise. And so engaging in a lot of these conversations can really suck your time if you're not careful. And so, if you're going to engage in one of them, I would say, do it with high intent, pick out your partner carefully, and probably, don't do it opportunistically because it'll take a lot of your time. The branding and organizational impacts we covered. So, the valuation of the asset and the operational impacts and the transition plan, these are just kind of the three rough buckets that I picked out for kind of attempting to capture everything that's associated with one of these things. It is a lot, and so this is not meant to be comprehensive. Valuation, I would say the key thing in determining the kind of whether or not a deal can be done is the quality of the revenue. And what I mean by that is how predictable is the revenue in the game that you're trying to sell to somebody or the game that you're trying to buy. So, if you have a month's worth of data, and I can look at it as the buyer, and I can easily see, okay, every Monday there's an event. It looks like this, but there's only a month's worth of data. What happens in month 2? What happens in month 10? Whereas if you have a year's worth, and it's very stable and it's very predictable, then that's essentially high quality revenue. It makes it easier for the buyer to understand, the key thing that they want to understand, which is how am I going to be able to operate this thing profitably such that I get my payback on the investment I'm going to make. Sorry. So key thing there, the third point at the bottom of the valuation of the asset stack there, they're going to want all of the information, and that means everything. There's nothing that would kill a deal like this faster than some lack of transparency on these points. And there's no reason for it in that you want to convince the potential new owner of this title that there is a business there for them. And so everything needs to be kind of above board in terms of the communication. If you have a type of UA that you're running that isn't kind of disclosed and then it pops up later, that will probably kind of have a very negative impact on the conversation you're having. If you have a cousin in several cousins in one in France, one in the Philippines, and one in Argentina, and they're all spending $10,000 a month in the game, that's probably something you should make the buyer aware of. Like whatever the program might be and however the revenue is coming in and however the marketing is being spent against that, those are all key characteristics of the conversation that they're going to need to understand. The operational definition of what's being sold, this is really the meat of when I said describing like the asset and trying to understand like how are we going to package it up and move it literally from one company to another. So it's a little bit like, like picking the needle up on an old style record player, changing the record and then putting it back down. So you're describing like a very complicated set of services and ownership structures that, like if you've never operated a free-to-play game before, there's a lot to them. But if you are, you can imagine like how would I tie off every single one of those and pass them over. So just to kind of go through the laundry list, there's the IP itself, and the IP covers a lot. So the IP includes the brands, it includes the technology, it includes the data that underlies it. You talk about data sets. There's the how do the data get used? Like who owns what in terms of like how those data have been captured. Like how do I transition that over to somebody else, all the way down to not just the database, but the for example the ad buying account rights. Like for example, this game is built off of using Facebook heavily. What about like Facebook lookalike profiles? How does that transfer over? Things like that. Infrastructure accounts, similar. So like, are you going to move it from their AWS account to yours? Like, are you going to kind of rebadge the account and give it over to them? Are you going to sell it? Like, there's all kinds of considerations at an operational level in terms of like each of the individual pieces that you're kind of transitioning from one company to the other. Affiliate deals are particularly noteworthy in this type of scenario. So if you're familiar with how an affiliate deal works, it's essentially you're giving up future revenue to a distribution partner who passes you traffic now, and then you commit to give them, say, a percentage of revenue over time. The new buyer is probably not going to want to undertake that obligation that you've entered into, or probably ask them to be liquidated. So these things, if you're not kind of in front of them and they get pop up later, they can slow things down, they can derail your process, they can create a lot of kind of misunderstanding around what the deal terms actually are. So just to be aware, like the description of the asset process is very important, and it's worth spending time on it to understand fully what they think they're buying and what you think you're selling, or vice versa. Because if you get into basically long form with a bunch of lawyers around these questions, like it can get really kind of acrimonious and sticky real fast. So I'd encourage you to have kind of business ownership level understanding of like what it is that you're actually wanting to engage in before kind of bringing in those kind of type of folks, because they tend to try and squeeze all risk out of an equation like this. There's no risk-free kind of asset sale transaction, and so the business owners really have to kind of understand it and drive it. Open source and shared tech, similar. Like the nature of like using something like that as a startup versus using something like that as a public company. Like that might get flagged by like some IT guy like later down the road. But if you flag it first and kind of have a good long-term conversation around it over the course of the entire deal, you'll be much better served. Underpinning all of this, and as a kind of as a frame for all of it, is the transition plan. Also sometimes gets a little short shrift in some of the conversations until the end, but it's really the key to consider as a central figure in all of the kind of negotiation. In that, like if you're receiving the title, you're going to want basically assurances that it's not going to fall over as soon as you basically take the ball. And if you're selling it, you want to understand what your obligation is. Like how many of my people for how long is this new company going to want kind of on the job, so to speak, and when can I get them off of there and transition them onto this new thing that I'm so excited about. I thought, like I was going to free up my entire studio and get them working on AR tomorrow, but it turns out that these guys are asking me to basically, run this game for another 2 months while they learn it. And that shouldn't be a surprise. I mean, like, how else would they get the game over to, like, train their staff? But, like, if you make assumptions that you build them into forecasts and you run with it, you can have kind of unfortunate conversations later on. A lot of this is fairly obvious once you start to look at it specifically. So like how will they run the game? I'm going to have to train some people. What am I going to have to train them in? Like, do they have those skill sets now? Are they going to have to hire people? Like, all these questions start to pop up as you kind of force yourself to get into these conversations around operations. The last couple things, liability in particular. In the case of like an equity deal where you buy the whole company, this is kind of a part of it. Like it is just an endemic part of it. Like you are undertaking the obligations of the entire company if you buy the whole company. That's not true in this case. You're not buying the whole company. You're buying a specific asset. And if the operator of that asset has done horrible black hat things on their watch while they were running the game, are you undertaking those liabilities too? Are you not? How do you carve off those conversations and kind of keep them from, kind of blowing up into something that they shouldn't be? And so, like the question of liability, again, similar to the one around just transition overall, is important to be realistic about upfront. Because again, you're not going to get to like a zero liability scenario on something that you built and you're trying to sell to somebody else. And similarly, like for the buy side, you're not going to get to zero either. So you have to have a very reasonable and upfront conversation around these kind of topics, so that you can get to a point where everybody kind of comes into the long form legal doc stage of things with a shared understanding and a realistic analysis of where they're going to end up. I think that's all I had. So if anybody has questions, we can get into those. Or not.
I've got it.
Sure.
Do you ever see situations where it's an asset purchase and a team, kind of a core part of that team? I don't want to call it rock, however, you know what I mean. You're getting some key game personnel along with the game asset.
Yeah, no, I think that's super common. I mean, it's common because who else knows the game better than the folks who are running it now? And so, like, it really depends on the conversation between, like the seller and the buyer, and the seller's, kind of need to move those people on to something else. In the case where, like, they would literally not have jobs for those people after the transaction is done, it's really easy. I think they would love for you to pick up that team. Whether or not, like the buyer has room for that, or, like it's an imperative for them, like that's really the critical thing, is like, can you find a scenario where they want to move those folks and you want to pick them up? Or is it forced on either side, where it's like, no, like you're talking about my best people, there's no way I could ship them over. I could give you, like these folks over here, but they've never run the game before. Like you start to get into different types of conversations that are much less satisfying. It does happen, where you have that perfect alignment of needs, where, like basically the selling party is like, look, like I'm not going to have jobs for them as soon as we do this. If you could pick them up, that would actually help me out a lot. And then everybody watch what happens. No, it definitely happens. Yeah.
I was just curious how you raised $85 million as a game startup, when here I can't even get publishers and investors to even acknowledge my meeting requests. So, how do you go from that to getting $85 million?
Yeah, no, it's a fair question. I wasn't there at the time when they raised $85 million, so I can only kind of like speculate and give you my kind of 2 cents as a sometimes investor. In this particular case, I think the founders of the company had basically a business that was like 2.2. They weren't raising from zero. They had basically a couple of games that they had started on their own. That's my understanding anyway. That's their particular example. But I mean, like, if you go through and kind of read blogs on kind of starting companies, as I'm sure you have, like the early raise has got its own kind of tricks of the trade to it. So like getting investors to return your calls, often a function of like, are you pitching the right thing? What's your background? What's the total addressable market size? Like, is somebody else competing with you? What's the nature of your product plan? There's a lot there. And so, like, it's not just as simple as, like, hey, these guys are jerks and they, like, won't return my calls. It's more about, like, these guys are looking for places to put money. That's their job. Like, they've been hired by people with even more money
They're
to put
looking
in their
for a
funds.
risk-free way to make more money is what they're looking for. That's why it seems they're all looking to invest in crypto here. They're not even interested in games
most early stage investors are not characterized as bankers, but they do have particular flavors that they're interested in. Some people are interested in crypto. I don't know a lot of games investors who are right now. But like there are other folks who are very much crypto investors who might be looking for ways to get into games. And so it's often the time of a question of finding the right kind of person to have a conversation with. Like if you research the type of funds and know the type of investments that they make, you'll have a better shot at matching kind of your needs to what they're doing. Yeah.
My question has to do with when you when in the past when you see these sales happen, what led to the sales? Like prior to the sales, everybody knew each other. They're all drinking buddies from college, and can you just talk a little bit about that?
I don't think I've seen any that were all drinking buddies. I'm sure that's possible. In the case of the ones that I've been part of, they were really driven by, kind of straight bottom line analysis. It's like, hey, here's what we need. Let's go out and find somebody who can partner with us in this kind of specific way. It's not an easy thing to do. I mean, on the plus side, there are a limited number of folks that you can have a particular conversation with. It's like, hey, I've got a match 3 game. It's got these characteristics. Like, who are the potential buyers of an asset like that? So that's a pretty knowable universe in the games world. There are kind of pop-up examples that might kind of surprise from time to time, but you can kind of take a swag and know plus or minus kind of 5 companies who the world of potential buyers are. If you get some folks who are kind of industry veterans on your side and kind of take them out drinking and ask their advice, you can probably get that down to a list that is the likely suspect pretty quickly. So you don't have to be drinking buddies, and I don't think that drinking buddies is the norm. Thank you.
What?
Would you say it's fairly common from an investor standpoint? I talk to a lot of developers that a lot of developers are looking for investors, right, pre-launch. But in my experience, I've found that typically investors want to see retention metrics before they're interested. Would you say that's pretty accurate, or where would you say investors kind of look to invest, pre or post-launch?
Yeah, I think I would caution against the word investors as if it was a block of people, because there's a bunch of different investors. There are people who make it their business to invest in an early stage, and people who don't. People who make it their business to invest in an early stage tend to look at the team as their kind of leading indicator of whether or not this is going somewhere interesting. So they'll look at whether or not that team has done stuff together in the past, whether or not there's people on that team that have kind of unique insights or kind of product strategies that kind of make them excited that they're going after something big enough to merit venture investment. And a lot of projects in the gaming space are not good candidates for venture investment, frankly, because these funds are looking for a particular type of return profile, and that's the deal that you're making when you take their money. And I think that's underappreciated frequently, because a lot of folks kind of come to it thinking hey, I just want to finish this game. Investors don't really think about it like that, unless you find people from the industry who are enthusiastic about your mission. That's not a venture investor. That's an angel investor or your Uncle Ned, whatever that might be. Their profile and their needs set and their everything I'm saying is kind of different from those people and how they process the information. A venture investor, they've taken LP money to produce a set of returns that they've kind of described to them, and so they need every deal that they do to match that profile. And so that's what they're bringing to every deal that they look at is this a fit for my kind of returns that I need to kind of do for my fund. So there are seed investors, there are kind of mid-range, and there are growth investors. If you pitch some growth guy about a seed deal, of course he's not going to be interested because it doesn't match at all. If you pitch people who normally do console about free-to-play mobile, of course also not a fit. But if you pitch somebody who's the right fit for your type of game and your type of project, at least you're starting in the right place. Not to say it'll work. This is not easy. Everybody would love to be their own boss and would love to run their own company, but not everybody gets to. It's not everybody can kind of manage to have that breakthrough game. It's a tough business. But if you are capable of kind of approaching the right group with the right strategy, then at least you're starting from the right place. Actually, the next panel is about investment. So let's just get right to that. Jeff? uncharacteristically quiet. The only one with experience, got nothing to say?
Yeah, but he doesn't know anything and my microphone doesn't want to work
All right,
anymore.
cool. Does anybody have any more questions about asset sales or selling live games, buying live games? Yeah, please.
I know I asked him, it's kind of the flip side of his question, which is if you're starting to move into the market of looking for either assets or small companies, single games to buy, how do you have any tips on targeting and sourcing?
Yeah, so I would say, like understand the, kind of the rough ranges that you're looking for and why. So from like a revenue size perspective, also from a, like a category perspective. So certain, kind of categories are different to operate. Like casual games operate different than mid-core games, operate differently than social casino. So like why do you want to be in that business? And then in terms of tactically, I think, like a lot of people in the mobile space, like they operate off app handling and sensor power data. These are kind of services that allow insight into the market that are pretty reachable by the average analyst. So it's not kind of that difficult to grab a subscription to one of those services and start to like parse the information and identify opportunities. But I think it does start with understanding your own needs set and like why is it that you want to buy this particular class of assets and how are you going to run them afterward? Because if you are coming to it from a dead stop, then you're going to need like either the buyer to sell you the team or some other solution. And there are solutions. There are companies that make it their business to support live services of games, like absent the original developer. So I mean, we've gotten to a place like in our business where like a lot of things are filled in terms of the operations profile that didn't used to be there. That said, like introducing that kind of complexity into a game that is hard enough to operate and be profitable, like without introducing that complexity, like it's kind of stepping a toe, potentially over the line, but like you could make it work, maybe. But I would say it starts with understanding what is it you want to buy and why is that the right thing, and having a plan, and you're able to measure everything you see against that plan.